You're listening to Girls with Grafts, a burn community podcast created by Phoenix Society for Burn Survivors, a leading nonprofit dedicated to supporting the burn community. In this podcast, we'll talk with burn survivors, share resources to help with supporting and improving burn recovery, and discuss how to prevent burn injuries. Here are your hosts, burn survivors and Phoenix Society's marketing team, Amber Wilcox and Rachel Kudlak.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Girls with Grafts. I am Rachel Kudlak. I'm one of the hosts of the show, and today, unfortunately, I won't be joined by my lovely co-host, Amber Wilcox. I know she wanted to be here for our last episode of Season 8. It's hard to believe that we are wrapping up another season, but our next season will be coming out soon, so if you missed any episodes this year so far, be sure to catch up before Season 9 arriving in August. So before I welcome on today's guest, I do just want to give a quick shout out to today's podcast partner. And today's podcast is powered by the Pritzker-Hagman Law Firm. The Pritzker-Hagman Burn Injury Legal Team helps burn survivors and their loved ones pursue compensation and justice throughout the United States. And you can learn more about them and their services at legaljourney.guide. And I'm so excited to welcome on today's guest. Today, we are welcoming Abby Horton. Abby is a certified child life specialist with over a decade of experience supporting children and families impacted by burn injuries and medical trauma. Her work spans pediatric burn care, inpatient rehabilitation, and critical care, with a focus on trauma-informed, developmentally appropriate support, school reentry, and family-centered programming. She continues to work in both hospital and community settings, including private practice, extending burn-informed care beyond the hospital. So, Abby, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Well, I know I just read your bio, but I would love just to learn a little bit more from you, a little bit more about yourself, and specifically how you got involved in burn care.
Yeah, thank you so much for asking. So like you mentioned, I've been a child life specialist now for about 14 years, which is kind of wild to think about. I started my career in New Hampshire at Children's Hospital at Dartmouth, where I worked in an intensive care setting. Met my husband while I was working there, and we matched for fellowship in Minnesota and ended up at a hospital that had a burn center and was sort of in transition looking for a child life specialist. The child life specialist who had sort of oriented me had given me a really great opportunity to get a glimpse into the unit and the team that worked there. So when the opportunity presented itself, I was really excited to be able to join the team. And there were so many welcoming professionals, people who were really great mentors, and I just fell in love with working with burn survivors, especially, children who had this experience. And so over time, I got the experience to help at burn camp and sort of family programming nights. So there were definitely a lot of really great mentors that kind of led me down the path. And, I had some really great experiences with families working in that setting there. And sort of fast forward to now, I continue to work with burn survivors with my private practice, but also sort of in other per diem roles in hospitals in New England. So
awesome. Well, I don't think we've ever had a child life specialist on the show before. So for our listeners who may not even know what that role is, can you just tell us a little bit more about it?
Yeah. So child life is sort of this unique role in that we provide developmentally appropriate and supportive care. And by that, I mean a lot of our education and training is focused on how child development is impacted by trauma, specifically like a hospitalization or a major diagnosis or a major accident. So our role is really to focus on how to help the child understand the hospital environment, how to normalize it as much as possible, provide education and preparation, and then most importantly, opportunities for play, because we know that play is how children process their world. It's how they sort of work out the situations that maybe you and I would talk through. Play is their vehicle to kind of understand what's happening around them.
Mm-hmm. Is there a certain age range that would, I don't know, if, like, works best was the right word, but like, what kind of age range of children are you working with?
Yeah, so we see children from infancy all the way to, 18, sometimes supporting young adults as well, just because we know 18 isn't necessarily the cutoff. All of a sudden you
Mm-hmm.
are an adult in all senses of the word. So, each child life specialist is trained sort of at the developmental stages until 18. So we see from babies all the way to, fresh adults.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know we got to work together recently because you wrote an article in our spring edition of Journey magazine, and that was titled Preparing Siblings and Children of Burn Survivors for a Burn Center Visit. Can you just talk a little bit more about how, I guess you don't need to, recite the entire article, but just tell us a little bit more of like why that, community of children and siblings of burn survivors is so important to make sure that they feel supported, especially when going to a burn center for the first time.
Yeah, I think sometimes one of the harder things about either being hospitalized yourself as a parent or caregiver or having a child who's being hospitalized is having to continue to focus on the world outside of sort of that experience. And we all know that the experience of being in the hospital is challenging enough. So it's helpful to have sort of other professionals in your corner helping you navigate how best to support those people who aren't in the hospital with you. So the article obviously focuses a lot on, siblings, but also children of adult burn survivors and how to best, prepare them. And we know that children often are taking in more than maybe adults give them credit for. And I think many parents and caregivers know that children often are listening maybe more than we always understand. And additionally, children, I think, can handle more than we give them credit for. So knowing all of that, but also understanding the deep desire and parental feeling of wanting to protect your child, how do you kind of balance those things? And so a great way to do that is to talk to your psychosocial team members, your child life specialists, and hear about what language, you can use to provide that care and that support in a way that's going to be palatable for them. And a sort of simple way to think about that is by having younger children, you're going to break down that information into smaller chunks. You're going to have to probably repeat it multiple times just because that's the frequency and nature in which they're going to need to hear that information. Older children, you can give them a bit more information because they have a better understanding of body systems and how the body works. So those are some like very basic points on, when you're delivering that information, how best to kind of prepare them for what to expect as they're coming into the hospital.
Mm-hmm. Is there like a certain age that, I'm just thinking, because when I was burned, I was 3 and my sister was 7. And I know, not speaking, for her behalf, but, she grew up really quick because the attention was primarily focused on me. I mean, my family and like my grandparents and my community was such a great support system to help my parents, especially with my sister's healing. But I'm just wondering too, if like, is there like a certain age for, especially a sibling or a child of that maybe you need to be even more cautious with versus is not that there's any good age for this to happen to a sibling at, but is there, maybe a certain period that you need to be a little bit more cautious?
I think each developmental stage and age brings about sort of different, really beautiful parts of that age and different, like you're mentioning, just things to kind of be aware of. So it's not uncommon, for kids who are, 5 and under to maybe worry that they did something to cause, the burn injury. If I there have been many instances where I've been talking to siblings in the playroom and they've said, well, I yelled at my sister last week and, I told her I didn't like her. And is that why this happened, kind of thing? That causation piece is hard for them to understand at that age. So, I think getting ahead of it as much as you can and explaining that, like, this was an accident, accidents happen, you didn't do anything wrong. And even if, because obviously this sometimes can happen, the sibling was involved in how the burn injury happened, still reiterating that point that accidents happen, and sometimes things align in the wrong way. It's not because you're a bad person or you were trying to hurt your sibling. Things like that are really important to stress. Obviously, the lack of blame and that accidents happen. And then kids who are older, I think can often worry, again, because of that understanding of body systems, a little bit about like the contagion aspects, like can I also like catch having a burn injury or things like that. And I think having a lot of curiosity and apprehension around the physical differences that can come after a burn injury. So like I said, I think every age group has really beautiful things about their knowledge and understanding and view on the world, but also things to just keep in mind that we know through research of child development that there are things that they're going to just kind of lean into or be a little bit nervous about.
And I know you mentioned in the article, that children should be given the choice whenever possible if they want to visit the burn center. Why is that, I guess, that idea of giving them a choice? Why is that so important?
Yeah, I think in an effort to help kids feel a little bit more comfortable, but maybe as adults are lack of comfort with just sort of the overall unknowns and just most people haven't experienced this before. It's not uncommon for adults and caregivers maybe to just assume that, kids would like to come visit and sort of bring them in and then kind of encourage them like, oh, sit on the bed, and direct them a little bit more than maybe they're ready for. So knowing that so much of this situation is out of the child's control, out of your control, trying to give them control back where you can. And I think the hard thing can be, understandably for parents, is when kids say, no, I don't want to go. But I will say, oftentimes in my experience, when they're given the opportunity to have that choice, they're going to come around feeling a lot more comfortable and ready and secure in how that experience plays out, through the rest of their development kind of thing. So because they're not being forced into a situation where they're not ready yet or they're not comfortable. And, a great way, if they do say yes, to kind of get them even more prepared is to allow them the opportunity with the consent of the burn survivor to see pictures of sort of the equipment in the room, what the room is kind of laid out like, explaining what they're going to see, what they're going to smell, what they're going to hear, who they're going to kind of encounter. All of those things sort of take out the surprise factor of coming into a hospital, because when you think about it, obviously most kids' experiences of medical settings are going to the doctor once a year, and that looks very different than maybe going into an ICU or walking onto a burn unit. And knowing that, there's a unit full of people who might have a variety of injuries, talking to your medical team about the best way, to bring your child in and when's a good time of day, and sort of working those logistics out to protect them a little bit and trying to take those unknown variables out as well, to try and give them opportunity for choice and control.
Well, and obviously every burn injury is different. Every hospital and burn center is different with, even just visitation and things like that. But is there a general time frame in terms of like when a child may be ready to go to the burn center? Or I guess like how would caregivers know when is the right time or when's an appropriate time to bring their child to the burn center?
Yeah. I think the hard thing about that is it's so unique to each family and each situation like you're describing. For some families, the right time has been when they're still in the ICU and keeping that visit kind of brief if, their loved one is maybe still under like a heavy amount of sedation and things like that. Some, I think burn centers have a little bit of guidelines just around obviously infection prevention and when that time is appropriate, just because understandably they want to be really cognizant and aware of, any germs or things like that could be coming in that could put, the loved one at risk. So
For sure.
sometimes those decisions are a little bit dictated by the burn center, but I also think, younger children, sort of like we're describing, do better with like short, brief visits, and then maybe going to visit the playroom or going to the cafeteria for a snack, like kind of associating and starting to create a little bit of routine with that, but keeping those visits kind of short and brief. And then older kids can, obviously be in the room for longer periods just because their attention is longer. They're going to want to ask questions and things like that. So honoring sort of whatever age and maybe what their needs might be.
Well, and I know, again, like every burn injury is different, every age kind of grouping is different too, but are there, I guess, do you have any recommendations on just age appropriate ways to kind of explain a burn injury, or maybe just a few? We have so many parents and caregivers who listen to the show who, whether they're still early on in, their healing journey, or even if they're a little further out, may still be struggling of just even talking about the burn injury to a child. So I'd like to, if we could spend just a little bit of time, talking about maybe not every single age, but just some general thoughts, for children.
Yeah, I think, sort of like we hinted at the beginning, for much younger ages, and by that I mean like, when kids are starting to be verbal around like 1 to 2 to like 3 or 4, those explanations are going to be pretty brief, especially depending on if they witnessed, what caused the burn injury or not, or if you're just giving the information of why their parent or sibling, isn't home like they normally are. Because that's the thing that they're going to notice the most, is sort of their constant in the environment is looking different. So, I think the Phoenix Society does a great job of sort of talking about those shorter versions of telling a burn story and the longer version. And so thinking about that language and how you would talk to an adult with this age group, thinking a lot about, so say, for instance, it's a patient's dad who got burned, and you say, Daddy's in the hospital right now. He had an accident where he got burned. The doctors and nurses are working really hard to help him feel better. And just explaining, we don't know when he'll be able to come home yet, but as soon as we know, I'll tell you. So, sort of the biggest thing about that is, again, not resisting the urge, I think, to give too many details, but also thinking a lot about this idea that you want to leave the door open for more questions. And then I think, also trying to weave in this idea that there's always going to be someone here to take care of you, and sort of firming up that ground for safety, so they feel like, although things might look different, there's always going to be someone to take care of me. Because that's something the kids obviously worry about a little bit too, is like, well, one of the people who normally takes care of me every day isn't going to be here. So what does that look like for me? And then, thinking about more of like the school age population, so 5 to like, let's say 10, again, they can handle more advanced explanations. So you can explain a little bit more about maybe it's their sibling, and you say, they're in a special part of the hospital right now where there's more doctors and nurses that are paying close attention to them and what their body needs to heal and get better. Do you have any questions about that? So kind of letting them lead the conversation more than overly providing too much information. Because I think that's, and in my experience, that's a way that you can kind of gauge how much information they're ready for. Because understandably, I think, and have experienced, that parents and caregivers often feel like, they put a lot of pressure on themselves to have this one big conversation, when in reality, it's, the conversation is happening multiple ways, multiple times, maybe before bed, maybe in the car, maybe during school. So a great way to kind of cast your net wide and support them too is, if you feel comfortable and have a relationship sort of with your child's school, especially for a school age child, giving them information and talking about, if this comes up and they have questions like, this is what we know kind of thing, because they're going to keep looking for to trusted adults, that information is consistent and the same. And again, like we talked about, their understanding of how the body works and things like that is much more sophisticated. So they're going to have more sophisticated questions. So I think overall the theme is, letting that age group kind of drive what questions they have, what they're ready to hear. And then teens, they're obviously capable of much more abstract thought. So they might want to talk more about the accident than maybe obviously younger kids will, and sort of what led to the burn injury. I think including them when possible in decision making is really important. So giving them a little bit of autonomy and control around how and when they want that information delivered, how much, but just sort of in a more complex way than school age kids. So, say for instance, again, it's a parent saying, dad is in the hospital right now. He had a burn injury from, hot oil coming off of the stove and catching fire. He was brought to the hospital. He's doing okay. There's doctors and nurses that are taking care of him. What questions do you have about that? So again, leaving room for those open-ended questions. But I think, again, resisting the urge to kind of front load with a ton of information.
Yeah.
Just knowing as well that even as adults, you're only processing at sort of heightened stress, like 20% of the information that you're being given. So understandably, anyone who hears that information about their sibling or about a parent, they're going to need a minute to kind of process that. So.
Yeah, I really like that idea of and it kind of goes back to what we were talking about, like even asking the child if they are ready or want to go to the burn center, of putting that control in them. And, because I can also imagine, parents and caregivers are, it's a stressful time, obviously, and then trying to prepare to have this conversation with your child, and, don't put so much stress on yourself either to always feel like you have to say everything or the right thing, and kind of having, like you said, that more open-ended question and, conversation versus feeling like you have a script that you're trying to prepare to them too.
Yeah. And I think, and I know through experience, what children remember overall is that the conversation, was given with love and care and support in a way that their feelings aren't being dismissed or unvalidated. Because that's another important piece of the conversation too, obviously, is helping them try and name, some kids, say that this makes them worried or sad or angry. All of these things are very normal and typical feelings when you have a parent or a sibling, who's had a burn injury. But also keeping in mind, like you said, that it's not about having the perfect script, because even if you're like, oh, I didn't get everything in that I wanted to say, or I just don't quite feel like I got it right. Kids care more than anything that you're keeping them a part of your family unit and including them, and they feel that support more than anything.
For sure. Is there anything, and we can kind of keep this a little bit more general, but is there anything that, caregivers and parents, should definitely avoid when talking about the burn injury or the burn center, or just anything kind of that's a no-no that we shouldn't be sharing or anything like that?
I think some things to keep in mind with that, especially obviously with adult burn survivors, is, if the adult burn survivor, like a parent, feels really strongly that there's certain information they don't want to share, trying to be really mindful and respectful of those wishes. And I also think trying to avoid making promises in general is just a good rule of thumb, just because as anyone from what I've heard who's had a burn injury knows, is that there's no just sailing along trajectory point. There's so many little potential bumps along the road that can come up. So doing your best, I think, as a parent, to try and create normalcy for that sibling or child of an adult burn survivor. And by that I mean, finding your community, your network, your support people who are going to help keep their routine as normal as possible. And it might sound strange, but I often talk to parents about keeping that child who's out of the hospital, in their typical sports practices or in their normal school, because that's what's going to help them feel grounded and tethered in a time that like they feel completely out of control. And that routine and normalcy is going to give them a sense of security. So, I think doing your best to avoid making promises about maybe when the loved one is coming home or how things are going to go, just because there's so much unpredictability. But instead, rather than making promises, to try and be reassuring, say that something along the lines of, I'm always going to keep you updated on what's going on with dad or what's going on with your sister. So if you ever have questions about that, you can always ask me.
Mm-hmm. No, that's such a good point of, I like exactly what you just said. Like, I will always keep you updated and try not to make those promises because to your point, a burn injury, there's always some setbacks. No burn injury is healing perfectly. So it could be little, could be big, but there's certainly things that come up and derail the plan a little bit. When I know we just kind of started talking about this like sense of normalcy at home. Can you just talk maybe a little bit more about that, or even to just some of maybe like the behavioral changes that siblings and children may be experiencing, or parents may want to be prepared to potentially see during a burn injury?
Yeah, so I think the thing that can be interesting for parents to observe is that when we think of trauma responses, I think as a culture, we don't always think about sort of the secondary bystanders of that. And by that, I mean the children who are at home and outside of the hospital. So when you think a lot about how children typically respond to trauma, so those things look a lot like potentially regression. So your child who was doing well, being potty trained, all of a sudden is having accidents. That's not uncommon. Having sort of outbursts in school or at home when normally, that's not a behavior you would expect. That's not uncommon. Seeing a little bit of withdrawal, so maybe not showing interest in things that they typically enjoy or just overall being a bit quieter. I want to stress that this isn't obviously a permanent thing, but when you start to notice it, it's helpful to kind of clue in and say, okay, they're processing this. How can I offer them more opportunities to process? And so like we talked about, offering opportunities for questions and reminding them that the door is open, trying to find subtle opportunities to validate those feelings. Reading books about, characters who have gone through something, significant. I know the Phoenix Society has Sarah's Steps, which as much as it's about, being a pediatric burn survivor, it's also about being the sibling of a pediatric burn survivor. So kids often feel most comfortable relating to a situation when it doesn't directly pertain to them, but seeing another character go through something very similar, that helps them see, okay, this is how they navigated that. These are the challenges that sort of came up, and this was sort of the outcome of that with support. So using books can be a really helpful tool to help kids kind of process what they're experiencing, but also, like we talked about, trying to keep their routines as normal as possible. So it can be hard. I say that with like the utmost understanding to ask for your community for help, but this is such a concrete way, all those people reaching out who are like, how can I help? How can I help? This is such a, helpful thing that they can do, is sort of help your child or children who aren't in the hospital by helping with school pickup or drop off, making meals that can be dropped off so that meals times can be as normal as possible. All that being said too, finding time for yourself as the caregiver of the burn survivor, maybe if there's two parents, swapping in and out. So one spending time at the bedside and one is at home, and then every couple days you sort of swap out, or however that works best for your family, so that, the child outside of the hospital is also getting some one-on-one time with you too, because there's something very meaningful and developmentally significant in having really purposeful one-on-one time with the child who's not in the hospital. And that can look like, saying, I have time today, for you and I, just to do something you and I. What would you like to do? Or offering up, maybe if they are more withdrawn, some things that they like. So how would you feel about going to the park, and then afterwards we could go get an ice cream together? And really emphasizing, that one-on-one time that's significant to just the two of you too.
Yeah, I think that's so important. Obviously, I don't remember everything that was going on when I was 3 in my burn injury, but I know like my parents, like to your point, leaned on like my grandparents and the community support to kind of keep that sense of normalcy. And then certainly like taking turns of one at home with my sister, one with me, and trying, there's no perfect parent and there's no perfect routine, and mistakes are going to happen, things are going to go wrong, but like looking back, I don't have, obviously I was the burn survivor, not the sibling, but I think my parents did a great job. And like to what I was just saying, that things I'm sure did go wrong, or they said the wrong thing to my sister, but that things are going to happen, but the bigger picture is that they did the best that they could to like to keep that sense of normalcy and to support her just as much as they were supporting me.
Yeah, and if those moments come up, there's a lot of research now, especially about the importance of repair, right? So it's not beneficial to anyone to put the emphasis on yourself as a parent to get it right all of the time. It's more important to recognize that you're doing the best you can. And if something happens where maybe you lose your temper or react a way in which you wish you hadn't, you always have the opportunity to go back to your child and say, I'm not really proud of the way that I just, yelled at you. That wasn't okay. And that's something I'm going to keep working on. But know that we're all feeling really sad and really stressed. And sometimes that's how we respond, but know that that's something that I'm working on. And I'm sorry that I did that. And that shows children not only that, hey, when I have an outburst, the love that you have for me isn't conditional, or I can't make mistakes because the adults around me expect me not to. So it shows them not only that having that emotion is okay, but also how to verbally work through that process with someone else of like, oh, I don't like how that made me feel. I don't like that I did that. But it's not going to have damage to my relationship with you because I'm apologizing for it, essentially.
Definitely. Well, I'm curious too, especially, I'm imagining like teenage siblings or children of survivors who, maybe take that withdrawal a little bit harder, and they, want to just be in the room playing video games and not, with, mom and dad anymore, don't want to talk about the burn injury. What is, I know we're kind of speaking in general terms because obviously everyone's different, but what's that like balance of, pushing them to talk about it, or just letting them kind of take it as they want? And I don't want to say like shutting out about it, but just not wanting to talk about it. Is there a balance that parents should try to find of, encouraging them to talk about it, but also respecting the boundary that they put up to?
Yeah, I think for teens in particular, sometimes something that's easy to forget is anyone is going to talk more organically when potentially you're doing an activity together. So, if potentially they're shutting down and playing video games or doing another activity that maybe you could potentially join in, and it doesn't feel like maybe they're giving you too much pushback, you could try that and just kind of sit silently, see if anything comes out. And then maybe if it doesn't, the first time, maybe the second time, ask a few questions, but try not to push too many. I think parents more than anyone know their child better than anyone else. So you're going to know like, okay, they're shutting down. Like this isn't the time to push this. And maybe if they're not responding to you, checking in, with their coaches or their teachers and just asking like, I just am curious, like they haven't said a lot to me. Have they mentioned anything to you about sort of what's been going on with their dad or with their sister or with their mom, and seeing if they've said anything to those trusted adults. And then if you're still finding that they're not, opening up or sharing, trying to offer them an outlet where they can express it, like a journal or things like that. And, potentially leaning on resources with your school, like a school counselor. It's not uncommon sometimes too for parents to bring a sibling or child of adult burn survivor to the hospital, and the psychologist or the psychotherapist or the child life specialist can meet with them. Obviously not regularly, but enough to maybe provide a little bit of an assessment. But also sometimes that person not being a parent, they're a little more willing to open up, and sometimes not, because they're like, you're a stranger, I have no relationship with you. Yeah. So there's lots of different avenues and things to try. I think, like you described, there's no one right way. It's just finding of those pockets of what's going to work best for that individual child. But I think, like you so eloquently put, there is such a balance to it, because you don't want to push them too hard, but you also need to give them the opportunity to process it in a way that's going to be beneficial to them.
For sure. Definitely. Well, I want to talk about kind of another common thing that I think tends to come up is, especially with a sibling of a burn survivor who may be angry or jealous that their sibling is getting more attention, or getting, both mom and dad, and they are feeling left out, or, even just that jealousy and anger component. What, I guess, tips or advice do you have for parents who are maybe experiencing some of that at home?
Sure. So we talked about this a little bit, but trying to create separate one-on-one time where possible, and being really intentional and purposeful about that. Trying as much as possible. And again, like we said, no situation or things are going to come up where this doesn't go perfectly, but to the best of your abilities, try and be very clear about, if you're one of the parents who's leaving the home, just saying, like, I'll be back on Wednesday and dad will go to the hospital on Wednesday, and being very clear and concrete about comings and goings, to, again, like, establish that foundation of normalcy.
Yep.
And I think trying your best to understand that it's really hard on both parties. Like, it's really hard on the sibling that they're kind of being pushed to the side. And as much as, we sort of make these accommodations to help them feel less that way, there is a bit of an inherent nature to that. So I think naming it is super important too, depending on, the age of the child. School age and older, they can understand that idea of, like, some kids say it's really frustrating and it's really hard that your brother or sister is getting all the attention right now. Is that in any way how you're feeling right now? And see what they say. And I think sometimes siblings can feel really guilty for that, because they know that, their brother or sister needs that extra help, but they also can't help but feel like, well, what about me? Like, I want mom and dad here too. So trying to validate those feelings and trying to offer them some strategies or support. So in the same way that we talked about, journaling and things like that, offering them outlets of, concrete things that they can do to express those emotions, of whether it be talking about it with someone, journaling, drawing. Those can all be really helpful things for them being able to process and feel that unique experience themselves as the sibling who's not in the hospital.
Yeah, it's when you were talking about, how a sibling can, two things can be true at once. Like, I can be sad that my parents aren't with me as much, but also I understand why they have to be with my sibling more than me right now.
Right.
And I think you mentioned this right when we started, but, I feel like we often don't give children enough credit for what they are understanding and what they're going through and how they can, process their own emotions. When you said that, I was just like, I feel like that's exactly how my sister felt like growing up. Like, she completely understood and was supportive, but I'm sure, also obviously had those feelings of, well, I want some of the attention too. It can't just all be about her all the time.
Yeah, no, and I think that statement of two things can be true, right? Like that's the dichotomy of being a sibling of a burn survivor, is that like you have your own feelings and then your family's experience and your siblings' experience that all kind of get swirled together in this sort of center of your family. And for a while, in the early stages of that injury, it's all encompassing. And then as time goes on, I think families find this beautiful way to sort of weave it in the fabric of their overall story. And not for nothing too, I think siblings of burn survivors, I remember observing this really clearly at burn camp, I think take a lot of pride in, being able to support their sibling and be a part of that story. And I think they feel very proud of their sibling who has survived a burn injury. So as much as it can be hard in the early days, I think there's a lot of resilience that overall the family kind of takes on from something that understandably is very hard and will continue to be something they have to navigate, but it becomes such a beautiful part of their overall family fabric and story.
For sure. That's such a good point. Well, you just mentioned camp a little bit, and I would love to talk a little bit more too about, the benefits of camp. I know it's camp season right now.
Yes.
I was a camp kid growing up. I absolutely have nothing but amazing things to say about camp. And so I'd just love if you could tell us a little bit more about your camp experience and, maybe for why the parents are listening, why they should, try to maybe get their child involved in camp.
No, camp, I mean, I just remember the first year I went to camp and it was I think anybody who's been to camp, it's like hard to put into words exactly how to explain the experience, but it's so powerful. It's so impactful. I think the thing that's so unique about burn survivors is that like in your community, it's not always easy to come across someone else who maybe is a burn survivor. So this is a way to spend a week or more with people who know pretty much exactly what you've gone through as a family, maybe to a slightly different degree or a slightly different story that's unique to their own. But it's so validating and important for kids to see other kids who have also had burn injuries or other siblings who have also had a sibling with a burn injury and what that experience is like. I've seen some really important and meaningful connections that are made that sort of carry these kids and families through the school year. So whether it be practicing telling their burn story in front of, a room full of other kids, or, getting more comfortable with sort of wearing compression garments around other people and things like that. It's such a unique experience because it's such a supportive environment, but it's also such a normalizing environment because oftentimes many burn survivors are the only in the room, and now all of a sudden there's a community of people behind them. The camp that I was able to be a part of, the great thing about it was there was every morning an age group that had devoted therapeutic time. So time with myself and the psychotherapist where we did planned therapeutic activities that really got to the heart of how to help them process their injury, share their story, and hopefully make going back to school, a little bit easier while also having some fun too. But then, they got to go into the larger group of campers and experience just being a camper. And that's exactly what kids need, right? Is this opportunity where maybe they get pushed a little bit outside of their comfort zone to help serve them in their self-confidence and their self-worth and learning to process what's happened to them. But then having that play side on the other end to just kind of play it out and be, a typical kid is invaluable. So I can't say enough good things about burn camp. And I'm sure you feel similarly, but.
For sure. I loved my time at camp. I mean, I truly think I wouldn't say I'm like the most confident person in the world, but so much of my self-confidence has come from going to burn camp. And, I have scars on my arms and my back and my face a little bit, but going to camp and going swimming in our swimsuits and having all of our scars out and like not thinking twice about it was like so powerful growing up that like as then turning into a young adult or a teenager and young adult and even into adulthood, like that confidence I learned and got to experience being like so young as a burn survivor was so powerful, and something like will be forever grateful for and appreciative of, that my parents got me involved with camp so soon after my burn injury.
Yeah, no, and I think the relationships that are made at camp like last well beyond camp, as I hate to say it as like maybe cheesy as some people maybe initially think it sounds, but it's true. I mean, it's so impactful, and I think just like gives people the sense of I'm not alone and I'm not the only one, and that is something that everybody needs, at every point in their journey. So such a great opportunity.
Sure. And like, to your point, you may not have another survivor in your community or your town, and then you go to camp and you're surrounded by so many other survivors, and you get connected with them. And it's so nice just having like your survivor friends that, like, regardless if maybe you're struggling with something related to your burn injury or not, but it's just nice when you feel like, yeah, there's a peer that's gone through something similar that you've gone through, and you now have that connection and someone to turn to. I know for me, like, I'm really bad at asking for help, or like, I don't want to make things about me. So I do love, though, like those survivor friends where maybe I am struggling with my burn injury or my self-confidence that day, and having those like friends who you can just turn to, and you don't. And I know even my non-burn friends wouldn't care if I reached out to them, but I don't have to feel bad when I'm asking one of them.
No, and I'm sure it feels different to ask them because it doesn't feel like, it feels like you're asking a peer in a different way. So
for sure.
That makes total sense.
For sure. Well, I know we are coming up on our time here soon, but I do just want to spend maybe a few minutes just kind of talking a little bit more about that power of play that we just were talking about, that we see at camp. And just, if you just want to talk a little bit more about, how play or storytelling can help children, whether they're the burn survivor or not, understand whether it's a burn center or just the burn injury, and the power of play.
So as a child life specialist, one of like the biggest tools that I lean on most heavily is play. Like we talked about, it's how, kids process things. For maybe a child that experienced having a parent or a sibling or themselves have to go in an ambulance, for instance, it's not uncommon, to see me bring an ambulance and people that will go in the ambulance and all these other materials to the bedside, and kids reenacting exactly how they experienced it. And I think understandably to parents that can feel concerning, but it's actually so helpful for them to be, and for those around them to hear, this is what they heard people say. As a child life specialist, I use medical play a lot, and that looks a lot like providing kids with an IV catheter. So that's sort of the IV with just the straw without the needle in it, and putting it in a doll if, their brother or sister or themselves have an IV, and practicing putting medicine through the IV. So rather than them having receive all this care or observing, maybe a loved one receiving it, they're the ones in control. And it's sort of wild in a way, hearing them sort of repeat exactly what they hear people who are taking care of them or their loved one, like, okay, this is going to give you like a tight hug, and we're going to clean your hand now, without like sort of enacting exactly the physicalities, but also the language that goes with it, is so important to sort of their experience and how they're processing it. We also use a lot of art as a modality for expression. So giving kids canvases to kind of, paint what they're feeling. We can, put a bunch of paint and syringes and do medical play through syringe painting. We can, put a big target up in the playroom and write all the things they don't like about the hospital and shoot the syringe full of paint at them. There's lots of ways.
I want to do that.
Yeah, I know. It's fun. So it's just giving kids an outlet to express themselves, but also just make it normal and something that they're used to and fun. And, just meeting them where they're at, and play is a great way to do that. So a lot of times burn centers understandably will have maybe small playrooms or toys that kids can access, because they know that that's sort of how kids are going to need to process what's happening. So whether it be a child coming in to visit the burn center, having that playroom accessible to them, so if things are starting to feel like too much, they can escape there and kind of process what's happening. You know, something that can be beneficial too is when you bring in a sibling for the first time, if they're a sibling, kind of similar to like when you bring a new baby sibling home for the first time, you maybe might give the older sibling a job. So, you know, whether it be a sibling or a child of an adult burn survivor, giving them opportunities in the playroom and asking, you know, would you like to make a card for mom or dad or your sister, or help decorate their room? Sometimes giving them a job can help them feel a bit more in control and remind them that they have a place within the family unit, and that's beneficial too. So those are all ways that, you know, play can kind of be brought into helping them experience, helping them feel more control, and helping them process, you know, what's been going on.
The playroom was always the best room at the hospital. And
as it should be.
And I went to Shriners in Boston, and at the time, at least when you got off the elevator, you could see the playroom before you saw anything else, because it was like out in the open. And then I was happy I was there because I could see all the toys I could play with.
Yes. And importantly too, playrooms are safe spaces. So the philosophy behind a playroom is that, you know, no medical conversations can or should happen there. No procedures can or should happen there. Like, this is the child's safe space. That includes a patient who is a burn survivor themselves or a child just visiting. That is their space in a way, within safety, you know, but to kind of dictate the rules of how things are going to look. And, you know, I think kids appreciate that, absorb that, and it helps them cope better because they know that. So.
Well, and you know what's kind of crazy is, like, I don't think anyone explicitly ever told me that, but I only have like such fond, amazing memories of being in the playroom, and I'm sure it's to that exact point of, because that's exactly what that room was meant for, and the only thing that was happening in that room. So yeah, I love it. And, you know, just to kind of go point, I actually might need to just like get a canvas and write some things on there that make me angry and get some syringe paint.
Yeah.
But I think that's, you know, so fun, as healing as it can be. And, you know, even I love the idea of like having the syringe with the doll, and, or even just like bandages with a doll, because I know, you know, my dad actually said when he first saw me after my burn injury that I looked like a mummy, and he was like shocked with like the amount of bandages that I had on me. So I think like that's also just another like fun way that, you know, you can involve play with that, like the medical supplies to help, you know, educate other siblings on what your sibling may look like or what they're experiencing or something like that.
Yeah, and sometimes burn centers will have access to like compression garments that fit on dolls, or face shields, you know, that can be modified for dolls, or mouth stretchers, or, you know, sort of all the things that kids can sometimes experience as they're healing from a burn injury, or adults, and giving them a doll to be able to kind of work through that is incredibly beneficial.
For sure. Well, Abby, I know we are coming up on our time, and we do have 2 final questions that we always ask all of our guests, but I just wanted, before I ask you those, kind of wanted to open it up and see if you had anything else you wanted to share with our listeners today.
I think one point I always just try and drive home is, especially to parents, and I feel like you also said this so kindly, that parents put a lot of pressure on themselves to be perfect, but I just would hope that parents could maybe file away on the hardest days, that perfect isn't as important as showing up, being there, showing that you love them and care and support, whether it be, you know, a sibling who's home or your child who's had a burn injury. So taking the importance off of, you know, trying to be perfect, and also realizing that kids, deserve to have information. And as much as we want to protect them from that, they're going to fill in the blanks. And it's better that they hear it from someone that they love and care about and have accurate information rather than misconceptions. So on the hardest days when you're like, I don't think I can have this conversation, try to remember that, they probably know more than maybe you think just because they hear everything. So trying your best, and know that there's a whole group of people at your burn center that can help you have that conversation if you need it. So
for sure, that's some great advice. Well, like I said, we always ask our guests 2 final quick questions. So I'm going to ask Amber's for her today. If there is one message you would want a sibling of a burn survivor to hear during burn recovery, what would it be?
You're important too. I think, sometimes they inherently just feel pushed to the side. So knowing that their needs are important and that they don't need to shut those things down is just, I think, an important thing for them to remember.
Mm-hmm. Love it. Well, I have a feeling you kind of already answered my last question with the wrap up you just shared before this, but I'm going to ask it anyway in case there's anything else. But our final question is our Phoenix Partner question today, sponsored by Pritzker Hagman. So their question is, what is one message that you hope sticks with listeners today?
Yeah, I feel like probably I already answered it, but
when you were saying it, I was like, oh, that would be perfect for this final question.
No, but I think maybe to think about another point, maybe reminding yourself that play is a vehicle you can always lean on as a parent. If you're worried about how your child is coping, remember you always have play, and everyone can play. There's no right or wrong way to play. So if you're offering your child opportunities to play, that is going to be one of the more beneficial things to their healing overall.
Definitely. Well, Abby, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. Thank you so much for writing that article for Journey Magazine. I so appreciate all that you do for the burn survivor community, and I just appreciate your time and expertise.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate having the opportunity to talk today. Thanks, Rachel.
Of course. Thank you. Have a good one.
Thanks, you too.
Thanks so much for tuning in to this episode of Girls with Grafts. If you are enjoying this content, please feel free to rate, subscribe, and leave a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. This helps others find the show, and we greatly appreciate it. Thanks again for listening, and we'll catch you in the next episode.